Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Fertility Confidence Podcast. I just got off an amazing interview that I've been looking forward to for weeks. I had a total fangirl moment because I was able to put together this episode for you with someone that I admire so much in the nutrition space, Lily Nichols. And she's well known for her two previous books, Real Food in Pregnancy and Real Food in Gestational Diabetes, that we reference to our clients all of the time when they have achieved pregnancy. And I was so excited to hear that she and her co-author, Lisa, put together Real Food for Fertility, which is really exciting. And when I got my hands on this book, I could not believe just the sheer amount of information inside. And it's not just about nutrition. Lisa makes such a beautiful contribution in terms of properly tracking your cycle and different ways in which our hormones are impacted. And then Lily brings in her nutrition knowledge, and it really is like a one-stop shop when it comes to just understanding how to approach your fertility journey and how to nourish your body. And we had a really beautiful conversation around some of the big topics in nutrition that I find really are getting like glossed over a lot of the times. And so being able to hear Lily share about the research and everything that she's seen with her clinical experience was such a wonderful experience for me as a practitioner, from both angles of like, one, being reminded of like what I'm doing is right. And I'm following the literature and also being able to learn some things along the way as well, which I really, really love in terms of all the podcast interviews I do. I love being able to learn things and actually being able to ask questions for my own knowledge, not just yours. So as a listener, thank you for giving me this space to have these amazing interviews and ask these questions. But this episode in particular, I think, covers some really important topics when it comes to nourishing your body. So give it a listen. As always, thank you so much for your support. You can find the book, Real Food for Fertility, on Amazon. You can also find more about Lily over at her website, LilyNicholsRDN.com, or over on Instagram at LilyNicholsRDN. And we're going to link all of that in the show notes for you as well. If you do enjoy this episode, please take 2 seconds and throw a little subscribe on here. Leave us a little rating and review. It helps all of the podcast feeds spread this episode to other couples who are looking for fertility information just like you. So I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you hitting play, and I will see you guys on the other side. Hello, Lily. Welcome to the Fertility Confidence Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I am really excited to chat today, honestly, because I feel like I'm having a bit of a fangirl moment myself. I recommend your Real Food and Pregnancy book to my clients all the time. Whenever they ask questions, I'm like, you just need this book. You just need this book.
Awesome.
I think it'll be really, really good for you. So when I heard inklings of the new book, I was very, very excited. But before we get into that, why don't you take a second and just share with our listeners a little bit about you?
Sure. Well, my background is as a registered dietitian and a diabetes educator. As you already mentioned, I have other books. So most people know me from my first two books, Real Food for Pregnancy or Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. I have a long clinical history of work with gestational diabetes, and I saw the need to provide better information on what was being given to my clients because at least early on, as a good rule-following dietitian, I would just provide the information that was in the guidelines, thinking that, oh, well, this must be well researched because otherwise, why would we have guidelines around this? Only to come and find that that information really didn't help most of my clients and often made their situation worse. And so that's what led me to write my first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. The pregnancy one, well, each book afterwards, I guess, has come about because my readers have asked for it. They're like, well, you talk all about gestational diabetes. What about general prenatal nutrition? And I really couldn't find a resource that I felt was like comprehensive and up to date. Again, many of them would just like rehash the guidelines, which I had already uncovered were like not as evidence-based as we had been taught.
Yeah.
So that's where the second book came about. And then like lo and behold, the third one on fertility, Real Food for Fertility, is really kind of serves as the prequel really to Real Food for Pregnancy. I had long just said, well, just read the pregnancy book, apply most of the stuff, minus like you can ignore all the food safety considerations and that whole topic. But generally speaking, just apply that and then get to know your menstrual cycle, read Lisa Hendrickson-Jack's book, The Fifth Vital Sign, and like combine those two resources and you're good to go. And at the end of the day, there's more to say than what's in those two books. And so Lisa and I teamed up to write Real Food for Fertility together, where we combine, you know, our expertise, mine in the nutrition sphere and hers in the menstrual cycle sphere. So you have the best of both worlds all in one place. And it turns out there's a whole lot more to talk about than what's in our other two books. When we put our heads together, it's like, oh, wait, we need a chapter on egg quality. Wait, we need a chapter on sperm quality. Wait, we need a chapter on PCOS and hypothalamic amenorrhea. And it turns into this gigantic project. So
Right.
Yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I mean, it started as a dietitian, but really have kind of taken up the role as a nutrition writer in the women's health space these days.
And what I thoroughly appreciate as a practitioner about all of your books is just the vast amount of resources, because I then, as someone who's interested in the research, can actually go and look at those studies and be like, oh, I haven't read that before. Let's check that out. But also there's just such a higher level degree of trust. So I can only imagine looking through, and I know with this book, I'm not sure with the others, but I feel like I heard you say with this book, you didn't include all the resources in the paperback version because there was too many. Was that true?
This is true. So we went kind of insane with the research. I mean, part of the reason Lisa and I wanted to write together was that we're both like really highly obsessive with citing our work. So, you know, inline text citations, there are over 2,300. Many of them cite more than one study because sometimes you want to cite like multiple papers in the same sentence. Like it's not just one study, there's all these studies. So we actually haven't done a final citation count, but we did have them formatted with the intention of putting them in the book, and it would have added another 200 pages to the book. And it's already 525 pages. It's a thick book. It's really heavy I mean, it's like really a beefy book. No one's going to want to travel with it if it's 725 pages. So we have the PDF download of the formatted references that all align with your in-text citations up at realfoodforfertility.com as a freely available download instead. So we made the best of both worlds. We do have a list of highlighted references. So we went through and chose approximately like 10 top references per chapter and included those. But it just became too insane to consider 200 extra pages. Like people don't want to pay for a book that's 700 pages long either, you know, it does get really expensive with printing costs. So it's like, this is sadly not going to work.
Yeah. I remember grabbing the book, Is Your Body Baby Friendly by Dr. Alan Beers. Have you seen that or read that? It's probably about as thick as yours, as this one, but like half of it is just references. Like I remember reading through and being like, I'm never going to get through this. And then hitting midway and going, oh, this is actually, this is all just the research, which is so crazy to think about. So there's so many like interesting topics in this book, but I pulled a few out that I think our listeners will be really interested to hear, and topics that I speak a lot about that I also don't hear a lot in the mainstream fertility community. And one of those being protein. I personally find women in general just notorious undereaters, but especially of protein, myself included. It's something I have to be very cognizantly aware of that I'm getting that in. And I can always tell, even last night at dinner, I was saying, I was like, I do not feel well. And I've probably had like 30 grams of protein today and been very active. So that's not really great. Like tomorrow
Right.
needs to be better. How much does protein really influence the fertility conversation?
Protein is huge. I'm just a broken record about protein in general.
Me too.
I wasn't sure, like, it's one thing to have the clinical experience and like firsthand experience with clients where you're like, really, these people need more protein and like all these things would be better. It's another thing to like really dig into the literature and find like, is there actually an evidence base for this thing that I'm observing, or these all just
Yeah.
happen to be like very similar clinical anecdotes? When you dive into it, protein has a lot of really important roles in fertility. So we need it for blood sugar balance. That's a huge one. Hormone production, maintaining our muscle mass, our lean body mass. We need it for liver detoxification. I mean, when you think about hormones, the liver is a really major site of hormone metabolism in the body. So if you're too low on protein, you can't make the enzymes necessary to like process your hormones and detoxify like the harmful types of estrogen, all that, get rid of estrogen mimicking chemicals that can wreak havoc on your hormone balance, and so on. It's also really important for your thyroid function and maintaining your body temperature. So out of all of our macronutrients, protein produces the most heat when it is digested. And so when you have clients coming in with like low basal body temperatures, you might be worried about thyroid issues. Oftentimes lack of protein is an issue. So it's important for all those things. Those are more like kind of structural major functions, but you start to look at its roles in fertility specifically. And what I actually found the most interesting was looking at the roles of individual amino acids on things like egg quality, fertilization, conception, implantation, the formation of the placenta, like all of these adjustments that have to happen physiologically to even allow conception to like take place and support the early pregnancy environment, which that happens before you get a positive pregnancy test, or many
Yeah.
of those stages happen before that milestone. So when you start looking at it from that angle, it's more than just like you need a certain amount of protein, but you also need a certain quality of protein. You need the right balance of amino acids. And to bring it back home to the more like general real life application, we do need more protein than most people think they need. If you look
Yeah.
at like the RDA for protein, it is set at a very, very low level. There's like two major ways the dietary guidelines set protein. They have like the RDA, which is like a gram per body weight calculation, and then they have like a percent of calories calculation.
Right.
If you look at the two of those, the RDA is set at like the very bottom of that percent of calories range. So in other words, like even by the own guidelines, you could more than triple protein intake and still be in a healthy range, but everybody uses this arbitrarily low RDA as a benchmark.
Right.
And that's unfortunate. My experience is women need more protein, and we do often see just issues happening with hormones, with menstrual cycle issues, ovulatory issues, blood sugar issues, thyroid issues, and just a whole gamut of circumstances that arise from insufficient protein intake. And that particularly applies at breakfast. So that's a big one, is getting enough protein at breakfast. It really sets your satiety signals for the day, your whole blood sugar and insulin homeostasis, really prevents you from being kind of living in a high cortisol state all day long. It just keeps your stress hormones happy. Like everything's happy if we just get some protein at breakfast. So
How simple does that sound?
I know.
Hard some days, but it's just such a huge piece. So circling back to the RDA and the overall amount, would you then recommend that women actually go by the percent per calorie recommendation more so in the middle to high range of that versus following the RDA that's set?
Correct. Yeah. So the RDA is set at like 0.8 grams per kilogram. I find that bare minimum, you need to hit like 1.2 grams per kilo, but it's arguable. It depends on which like study you're reading.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the 1.5 to 2.2 grams per kilo. So at the upper end, if you do the calculation from kilos to pounds, that could be the equivalent of about a gram of protein per pound of body weight or per pound of lean body mass. There's different ways of calculating it depending on the client you might be working with. And if you look at that as a percentage of calories, that often works out to a minimum of like 20% or so of calories from protein. And on the flip side, if you look at the RDA, that's set at about 10% of calories. So
Nice.
for most people, like doubling whatever you've been told, aim for double. Protein is a nutrient that is very difficult to overconsume because it's so satiating that you will simply stop. So even
Just
when they
get
have
full.
dietary intervention trials, they're like, we're going to do a 40% of calories as protein diet. The people end up consuming like around 25, 26%. Like it's hard to
Mhm.
overdo because you're so full. Even when you're meeting with a
Yeah.
dietitian telling you to eat all this food, like you can't because you're so satiated. So that's also a point I need to drive home. Like we don't need to
Yeah.
be worried about eating like too much protein. That's like
Yeah.
a non-issue usually.
I get asked that question a lot too. And my response typically is like, I can almost guarantee you you're not close to being over because you're probably like, you're feeling like a lot at probably like 100 to 120 grams, which
Yep.
is likely in that like mid, even potentially low range for some
Yeah,
people, especially depending on their like exercise and movement routine, right? Because the
exactly.
more you move, or if you're building muscle, or if you have fitness goals that way, that's only going to drive that number up as well.
Exactly. And that's a very good point. Athletes often need more, and yet oftentimes we see female athletes significantly under eating
Mm-hmm.
protein requirements. Like you need more because your muscles and your connective tissue are undergoing like micro damage with every workout. You need to replenish so they can rebuild and heal. And yeah.
How does this conversation go for our like vegetarian and vegan friends? Do you find, I find that they really, really struggle with the protein just kind of across the board, but do you feel it's possible to hit those requirements with maintaining that style of diet?
So that's a challenging question to answer because it depends on many factors.
Mhm.
I have seen it done when eggs and dairy products are part of the diet. I've also seen it done if there is a heavier reliance on supplemental protein sources.
Mhm.
Um, the only challenge being if those are like vegan protein sources, the protein quality and the amino acid balance isn't there. So even though, it says you're getting 20 grams of
Right.
protein per serving, the amount of protein your body can actually utilize from that might be, 75%, might be like 50% of what's in there. So that adds a little bit of a challenge, but much easier when dairy products and eggs are included, particularly if you're choosing some high protein dairy products like cottage cheese and Greek yogurt. That
Mhm.
really, they pack a lot more protein
Right.
per gram than, a glass of milk, for example.
Yeah. I used to think cottage cheese was like the absolute most disgusting thing I had ever seen in my entire life. And I was like, I don't know how people eat that. That's really gross. And then a couple months ago, I was like, okay, cottage cheese is this like beautiful protein source that I feel like maybe I'm missing out on. And I saw people mixing it in scrambled eggs. And I was like, I am going to try that. I think that that will hide this disgusting texture of, if you've never seen cottage cheese before, if you're listening, it is just, they could make it look more appetizing. I personally think. And it's so good, like mixed in
Yeah.
scrambled eggs. And it just, oh, and I love feeding it to my kids because they love it. And I'm like, you guys have no idea. Like
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
having such a
yeah.
nutritious meal right now.
No, it's a good option. I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with cottage cheese. I'll go through phases where I'm like really into it and then like really not into
Yeah.
it whatsoever. So it's like it's hit or miss, but it's great when it's working for you. Enjoy. Some people add it to smoothies too, or to like a
Mm,
pancake recipe and like a blender situation. So it's all like ground up. You don't even
mixed
notice
in.
it. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's definitely ways to sneak it in.
Yeah, I saw some like oat cottage cheese pancakes actually this weekend on social media and I saved it. I was like, this will be good. The
Yeah.
protein powder we sneak in our pancakes right now is on back order. So we've been like scrambling to try
Oh
to
yeah.
find
Yeah.
something that my children will actually eat.
We sneak the protein powder into pancakes as
Yeah.
well because yes, also with the kids, it's just like any chance you can, you want to get
Yeah.
the protein in.
Yeah, they'll eat the pancakes, so we hide as much stuff
Right,
in there as we
exactly.
possibly can. The other thing that I found really awesome from the book, Lily, was your take on intermittent fasting, because this is another thing that I get asked about a lot, but also feel like I have different opinions than other practitioners out there. And I would love for you to just share a little bit about intermittent fasting and fertility and what you found in the research when writing the book.
Yeah. So I also have mixed opinions on intermittent fasting. On one hand, you have this fairly large body of research showing seemingly miraculous results for,
Mm,
metabolic health, blood sugar, insulin resistance, cardiovascular health. And yet most of that research has been done in men and not women. So again, when you look at it from the angle of like real life practice, you're like, okay, well, the clients that I've had doing intermittent fasting, like their cortisol's disaster, their appetite regulation is kind of a disaster, their sleep's a disaster, their menstrual cycles are a mess, they're not ovulating, like what's actually going on here? Um, my my opinion on it is that I think most people who are doing intermittent fasting are doing it for with the goal of weight loss often. And so when they embark on it, they're not just limiting their eating window to a certain number of hours per
mm,
day. They're also limiting the amount of food they're eating.
right.
And that's really tricky when you're thinking about fertility and your menstrual cycle. You need to be ovulating in order to conceive, right? And therefore, when you start looking at any sort of calorie restricted diet, I mean, we have like really intensely designed controlled feeding studies where they like limit the amount of calories by a certain amount and like watch for how long it messes up the menstrual cycle. It usually starts with a shorter luteal phase or a luteal phase defect and then progresses towards anovulation. So like ovulation stops and then your period stops too, like you have amenorrhea. Um, and that can happen with a caloric deficit of as little as 25% of calories. So
Mm,
if you have, embarked on intermittent fasting and you're doing it in a way that is calorie restricted, which a lot of people do spontaneously even end up eating less calories because there's fewer opportunities to eat.
right. Yeah.
So, when you talk about protein intake, for example, and you're limiting yourself to an 8-hour eating window and you're trying to hit, let's just throw out a ballpark, say 120 grams is right for your body. Are you really going to be eating 3 meals of 40 grams of protein within that 8-hour window?
I
Like,
wouldn't be able to.
I wouldn't be able to either. Like a
Yeah.
40 gram of protein meal keeps me full for quite a while. So I
Yeah.
would end up just under eating as a whole. So that's where you get like the fertility concerns. There have been, I want to throw out a caveat in that there have been some trials, small, that have been in women with PCOS. There's one I'm thinking of in particular where they did it in a very unique way in that they didn't have the women skip breakfast. They essentially had them skip dinner. So their eating
Mm,
window was 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. It was a small trial, I believe only like 15 women, but it dramatically improved like almost every parameter you can look at for polycystic ovarian syndrome. But they had the women specifically eat sufficient calories. They were not
mm,
putting them on a calorie deficit.
yeah.
So in that instance, you know, maybe it could work. I do think intermittent fasting is certainly a mismatch for anybody who's on like the hypothalamic amenorrhea spectrum, like any issues with like not being able to maintain your cycle as a result of insufficient caloric intake or over exercise, any sort of athlete, like just skip the intermittent
Yeah.
fasting, please. And I also want to point out that we have like abundant data on improving PCOS through means other than intermittent fasting,
Right. Yeah.
particularly by like upping their protein intake, improving the quality of carbohydrates. So, you know, I think it's an option. Like I wanted to cover that data out of completeness sake. I think for a certain subset of people, it might be a good choice. I would say
Mhm.
for the majority of women, just like approach intermittent fasting cautiously. We do have like a section on it in the book giving you some like parameters to look for to decide whether or not it's a good idea. And then if you embark on it, like whether or not it's working for you, some warning signs to consider. But if you do, please try to eat enough calories and protein if you
Mhm.
can. It might be hard though. So
Yeah.
it's a challenge.
I find sometimes even because some of my clients will come in intermittent fasting and they're like, I actually feel really great. And it's like, okay, cool. We can try to make this work for us. But first, like, how is your stress? How's your cortisol? How's your cycle? Like, make sure there's none of those red flags. And sometimes just extending their or shortening their fast, sorry. So if they're like at a 16-hour fast, like
Yep.
can we pull that down a little bit?
Yeah.
Give your hormones a little bit more time and yeah, make sure that you're actually eating enough. Cause I agree. I see the same thing where it's like, well, I'm intermittent fasting, but in that intermittent fast, they're cutting like 800 calories. It's like,
Exactly.
we might not like right now, you might feel really good, but in, 4 to 6 months, we might actually be going
Exactly.
backwards, which is not what we want to be doing when we're trying to get pregnant, obviously.
Yeah. Your body really wants that signal of like safety. Like I have enough
Mhm.
resources to get pregnant and then like nourish this pregnancy and maintain it. And when the body gets any sort of a hint that like, oh, it's like
Mhm.
it's a time of famine, you know, it's like it wants to put ovulation off the table because it doesn't even want
Mhm.
pregnancy to happen. And
Right.
that's like an angle that we go into at the very beginning of the book, some of the sort of historical context in some of these hunter-gatherer communities, similar to what you see with wild animals, where there's like a fertile season and a non-fertile season. Same thing can happen for humans. I mean, nowadays we live in an area where you have like grocery stores and things to like buffer differences in seasons. But if you are living as like a nomadic human and it's a dry season or it's a famine, your body doesn't even want to like waste the resources
Right.
in ovulation and menstruation. So it just like backs off. And the same thing, it could similarly, you can get the same sort of signals with fasting, particularly prolonged fasting or low calorie eating as a whole. So I think that's just a helpful like tidbit to have in the back of your
Okay.
brain. Like, what
Yeah.
kind of signal is this sending me right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talk a lot about stress and we get very fixated on like how do I manage my psychological stress? And a lot of my clients are surprised when we take them down the other path of like, well, let's also talk about like physical stressors, like are you eating enough? Are you sleeping
Yep.
enough? How are you moving your body? And maybe we can't change your work environment that's causing you a lot of stress, but can we make helpful improvements in how you're actually treating your physical body or the environmental stress that we're potentially dealing with? And I think just simply consuming enough food is such a huge potential treatment for so
Yeah.
many women that are struggling to conceive because for so many years we've been taught like everyone in this like reproductive age right now we all grew up in the same time frame of low fat, don't eat a lot, like to be healthy means less, and we're having now to
Mhm.
completely reframe a lot of that limiting belief
Yeah.
underneath.
Salad for lunch.
Right. Yeah.
And now the widespread like don't eat meat and red meat is bad for you. And
Yeah.
that has its own potential downsides as well. So yeah,
Mhm.
it's rough out there for women with the with the media, the mixed messaging, the outdated
Yeah.
nutrition guidelines. It's all over the map.
Yeah, it's so true. Another piece that I find women are really fearful of is soy, and
Mm.
how like especially women who don't consume a lot of animal products. I'm like, well, I'm eating a lot of soy. Is that bad? Or women being concerned about any amount of soy. What do you find the research is sharing in recommendations to soy and women's health and hormones, but fertility specifically?
Yeah, so there have been a number of studies looking at soy. I mean, oftentimes soy intake is highest amongst vegetarians, those who are avoiding meat entirely. In fact, if you look at the research on what vegans consume, it's a significant portion of their calories are actually coming in from soy. It's like soy and carbohydrate foods,
Mm.
generally speaking. So there are phytoestrogens in soy that can, bind to estrogen receptors and affect essentially your hormone balance in your body and your hormone signaling. I think whether or not that's going to affect you depends on the quantity of soy. I think it also depends on the quality of soy that's consumed. So beyond the phytoestrogens, soy is a crop that is sprayed pretty heavily with pesticides, particularly glyphosate, because we have this Roundup Ready genetically modified soy that's sprayed with Roundup. Active ingredient is glyphosate. That has all sorts of crazy effects on our hormones and fertility and mineral bioavailability in our body that I go into quite a bit of detail in the book. And so if the soy intake is particularly high and like non-organic, organic soy cannot be sprayed with Roundup. That's when I tend to see the biggest risk of issues. And one of the things that I go into a little bit in the book is like the traditional angle on soy food intake in Asia, because people argue like, oh, well, it's a huge part of the Asian diet.
Mm.
And actually it is traditionally a part of many Asian cultures' diets, but it's not a huge part of the diet. Like average soy protein intake is something like 10 grams a day. But you look
Right.
at like a soy protein bar, and you might be getting 15, 20 grams of soy protein right
Yeah.
there. It's also consumed in more traditional manners where it's been fermented or like a long cooking process or made into miso or something like that,
Right.
which can offset some of the compounds in soy that can be kind of problematic to our nutrient metabolism in our body, like phytic acid and those sorts of compounds. And so I don't know that soy is like, yes, for sure, it's always going to cause hormone issues, but
Right.
for somebody who's heavily reliant on it as a primary protein source, and if it's mostly like non-fermented, non-organic soy, then yeah, like I do often see it disrupting the menstrual cycle. And so I think you just need to be aware of
Mhm.
what you're consuming and then try to monitor and see what's happening. Are your cycle parameters truly within the normal range, or is there something like a little bit off? How's your digestion? Um,
Mhm.
Soy can be particularly difficult to digest when it's in an unfermented form or when it's been like isolated into a soy protein isolate and put into like a meat analog kind of a
Yeah.
product. So like,
Mhm.
how's your digestion going down? Because I mean, ultimately our digestive health and how many nutrients we're absorbing from our food does have carryover effects on our fertility. So those would be some of the things I'd, have in the back of my mind.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking back the whole time you were speaking about how I was a vegetarian for many years in my life, and I literally lived off those little soy chicken nuggets.
Mhm.
I was not a good vegetarian. I was very unhealthy. And when I moved away for university, my doctor was like, you need to eat meat now. And I was like, okay,
Oh, wow. Well, then you must have
I am
gotten
unwell.
you
He's
got a
like, you
kick
either
out of
eat
the
meat or you're gonna have to go to the hospital. And I was like,
oh
okay,
gosh,
cool. It's like
really like
not good.
anemia.
Pardon me?
It was like anemia
Yeah, I was like
situation, severely anemic.
severely anemic.
Yeah.
Nothing was fixing it. I was so just tired and like a shell of a human, honestly. But
Wow.
I stopped eating meat when I was like 13, and my parents were kind of like, you're on your own, girl. Like, if you don't want to eat what we cook, that's fine. So I basically just lived off of like French fries and soy chicken nuggets and like the odd fruit. And
Yeah.
quite surprised I survived as long as I did,
I mean,
honestly.
I've been vegetarian before, and I was actually a model vegetarian. I would like soak my beans and make my kale white bean soup with the, seaweed in it, and the like, and I bottomed out within like 6 months. I was like, this is not right for my physiology.
Mhm.
But I have many friends and family members who are devout long-term vegetarians and vegans. So, um, you probably noticed there's a whole chapter on vegetarian diets in the book, and I try to take a very like non-emotional stance to the topic and really just keep it like focused on the facts
Yeah.
and what's happening in the body. And but we do have tips in there on optimizing a vegetarian diet should somebody choose to do so. I do think there are people who their physiology, their genetics, whatever, like they really truly can get away with it. And
Yeah.
there's other people where whatever their genetics are like myself, it's like just not, it's like not
Please stop.
compatible with my
Yeah.
physiology
Yeah.
really at all. So in that chapter, we also have like a section on options for reincorporating animal foods, because that's the next question that people always ask. They're like, okay,
Hmm.
health is like not in a good place. I know now that I need to include some animal foods, but I'm scared. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know where to start. This is scary. I haven't eaten meat in this long. Like, what do I include? Like, what if my digestion's a mess? Or sometimes
Hmm.
you have people where their dietary choices aren't related to health at all. It's purely like environmental ethics or
Yeah.
religious, spiritual reasons. And so I give you like options on some things to consider, because at this point, I think I've heard it all. And I'm not here to tell anybody you have to do X, Y, Z, but I am here just to provide you with the resources and the statistics on the potential caveats of any particular eating pattern. So I do hope that chapter is received well. I expect
Hmm.
to receive a lot of pushback on it too, but that's
Yeah.
inevitable with anything these days.
Yeah, totally. I think it'll be helpful just for us and my team for sure, in terms of we've walked that path with clients before of like, how open are you to including animal products? Like, we're not saying you have to, but let's just have this conversation from a place of science and research, because that'll help us help you, and have navigated some of our clients through reintroduction. And it is, and being someone who also did it myself, like it
Yeah,
is very challenging.
it
And
is.
I still to this day, like I've been eating meat for like probably 13 years, but I still am not super comfortable cooking it, because in that like time of life where I feel like you really learn to cook, that wasn't something my mom was showing me how to do because I
Right,
didn't care. And then when I left the house, I was like, oh, I don't know how to feed. I just
right.
didn't understand. And so even still, now I use it as a crutch because my husband loves to cook. And I'm like, I can't cook that. And he's like, oh.
Wise choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now I've just
Use
let
the
it roll.
flavor.
I'm like,
Yeah,
I'm okay with this.
yeah,
But it's so overwhelming of like, what should I try? Am I going to feel sick? Like, how do I cook? How do I prepare this? And I think that in of itself can make it feel sometimes like more of a feat to introduce it, even if you've had the inklings already of like, maybe this isn't serving me right now.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there's actually research on like reintroduction of animal foods in people who are vegetarian in the past. And a common term that's brought up is disgust.
Yeah.
They're disgusted by the idea of consuming animal foods. And so that's one of the options that I go through on like how do you reintroduce? Like, you might choose to prioritize what is least disgusting to you. You know what I mean? So for some people that's like eggs or dairy
Yeah.
products or fish, or maybe it's like pre-cooked meat, or meat that's already into something like a chili or like a chicken soup or something
Yeah.
that like you're not handling the raw
Yeah.
meat, like, ugh.
Yeah.
So yeah, you really have to play it by ear. It is, I've walked that path with a lot of clients, and it's a tricky one for sure.
One of my clients was really struggling, and I was like, how about you guys go on a couple date nights this month? And your task at the restaurant is to pick a meal that has animal protein so that
Yeah,
you can try something, but you don't have to buy it, prepare it, like see it cooked. It can just come, and something like mixed in a sauce or mixed in with other textures. And that was really helpful for her to just like try. They found a few things at home they liked, but then in order to like try other things, they would go out twice a month to their favorite restaurants and try some other stuff
that's a
and like
great
have a
idea.
safe appetizer so that she could like at least make sure she ate enough if she ended up not thoroughly
Right.
enjoying her meal. And so, yeah, we've been recommending that a few times. I'm like, well, if we're going to do this, like, it's time to go out. It's
Yeah,
probably the easiest way to do it.
that's a really excellent tip.
Mhm. All right, Lily, I have a selfish question that I'm curious about. And I just want to know if you have like a favorite nutrient. Like, what is something you
Hmm.
love talking about? What is something you feel is uber important that maybe doesn't get enough hype in this world?
Gosh, that's hard to choose. I mean, if I'm gonna go by probably the one I talk about the most outside of like the protein conversation, it would have to be choline.
Mm.
So choline is a B vitamin-like compound. It has some functions in the body. Kind of, I call it like folate's long lost cousin because it functions in a lot of the similar pathways like methylation that folate does, and does also support neural tube development. Everybody thinks about folate and the prevention of neural tube defects. Like choline also has a direct role in the prevention of those. And I also think choline, I mean, part of why it's an interesting nutrient is it is the most recent micronutrient to be added to the essential list, at least in the United States. It wasn't recognized as an essential nutrient until 1998. So
Mm.
before then, we had always assumed the body can just make enough choline from other things because we do have an endogenous synthesis pathway for choline. And women in particular, we produce more choline. It's really dependent on estrogen levels. However, as of 1998, we found like, oh, actually, that pathway isn't sufficient to supply optimal levels of choline. And if you don't take in any, you actually end up with fatty liver disease. That's how they did the depletion studies. Was wow, you deprive, it was adult men, but still, you deprive men of choline and they literally, it causes fatty liver
Wow.
disease. And I don't use the word cause very much in my language. I'm pretty careful
Yeah.
with that sort of stuff, not associated with causes.
Yeah.
And I think another reason it's an interesting one is that most of us are not getting enough, particularly women, like 90 to 95% of women are not getting enough choline. And it plays such important roles in the like early prenatal development timeframe with the neural tube defects, but it also is supportive of our liver health. It supports placental function during pregnancy. It supports our brain health and cognitive function, but also brain development in babies. And where do we find the most choline? It's in foods that we have long been told not to consume. So
Mhm.
egg yolks and liver and some other organ meats top the list for the richest sources of choline. And yet we've been told not to eat those foods for many
Right.
reasons. Probably the largest one, at least outside of pregnancy, is the fact that they also contain cholesterol, which we used to think was evil. Now we realize that was completely misguided. In pregnancy, there's some other, different also misguided considerations on, like vitamin A, for example.
Yeah.
So, it begs the question, if choline is essential, we now know, the recommended levels they came up in the late 90s are, I mean, they're based on data from men, so they made estimates for women and for pregnancy and lactation, but we now have pretty significant data, like randomized controlled trials showing we might actually need like double the amount of choline than they thought. Which begs the question, like, can you get enough choline if you're not consuming these foods that are richest in choline? And the
Right.
answer is probably not. So it's a really, really tricky nutrient for people to get enough of if they don't consume eggs. That explains like half of our choline intake right there. Eggs
Yeah.
with the yolks, because the choline's only in the yolks. And then from there, when you have people who eat, for example, a vegetarian diet, unless they're taking like a choline supplement, which there are vegetarian choline options, most people aren't. And vegetarians consume like half the choline that like a typical omnivore consumes. So it's a tricky nutrient. I think it's one we need a lot more attention on. It's not like standard that it's in all multivitamins or prenatal
Mm,
vitamins, and that needs to change.
yeah.
So I do like to highlight that one quite frequently.
I'm glad that's what you picked because I think you're the first person that was really talking about this a couple of years ago that I remember being like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. Like I had read a few really cool studies with like baby and infant development with choline, and my wheels are spinning, and I'm looking at all the prenatals all my clients are using, and I'm like, none of these have any choline even in them. And some companies even took it out over the last couple of
Oh,
years. And like, there's not a lot of choline supplements, at least here in Canada, which things are a little bit different in terms of like what we have available. There's not actually a lot of professional lines here that have choline supplements. So
yeah.
we really do have to harp like the food component. But it is a tricky one. And I think it's so important. And like you said, I think in the next, hopefully, couple of years, we're going to start to see a change in the supplement industry, specifically with choline. Obviously, that's always a bit slow, but hopefully we have more
Yeah.
access to something to help if the nutrition part, of course, isn't there first and foremost.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one on the supplement angle for like fitting into a prenatal vitamin, for
Right.
example, because it's a really bulky nutrient. It takes up
Mm,
a lot of capsule space.
yeah.
And
Yep.
so when people are expecting a 1 a day or even like a 3 a day prenatal, you won't be able to fit much choline in there, if any. It does often necessitate a lot more capsules to get a decent amount, unless they're also leaving out like other important things
Yeah.
like magnesium and calcium and other things that are like
Other
very
heavy, bulky
bulky,
things. Yeah.
take up space nutrients. It's also expensive. That what I hear from my colleagues who work in the supplement industry, it costs a
Mhm.
lot, so that drives the price up of the prenatal. And then some types of choline have a strong smell to them. And so then that's off-putting because people
Yeah.
open their bottle of supplements, they're like, "Ugh, this smells bad."
Yeah.
So it's a really tricky one for
Yeah, I bet.
manufacturers. I feel like unless there's like guidance in place, kind of like pushing their hand towards putting it in there, or consumer demand, a lot of times they just choose to leave it out or put in little pixie dust
Yeah.
amounts. So it's like it's on the label, but it's like 15 milligrams, which
Yeah.
nothing.
Not helpful. Not
Yeah,
helpful
yeah.
when we want like more than 10 times that.
Yeah. Like an egg has, it depends on the size of the egg, but like 120 to 150 milligrams of choline. I mean,
Mhm.
egg yolks are really highly concentrated. So like 15 milligrams, yeah, it doesn't get you very far. The
Yeah.
like goal in pregnancy, and these are like the low ball current recommended levels are like 450 milligrams. Optimal levels, the randomized controlled trials have used 930 milligrams. So
That's a
yeah,
big change.
15 milligrams won't they won't get you very far.
Yeah. A few years ago, I went through the process of formulating a prenatal, and it was very eye-opening with like, well, I want all of this. And they're like, okay, that will be 12 capsules. I'm like, I do not want 12 capsules.
Yes.
I want 3 capsules. And they're like, well, this is what we will be cutting. I'm like, okay, I get it now. I get why
Yes.
they're not all that awesome because it's really difficult to fit everything that you want in, but it also kind of circles back around to why nutrition is such an important piece because we shouldn't be relying on our prenatal to give us all those nutrients. It should
This
be
is
like
true.
a top up, right?
Yes, exactly. An insurance policy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about the book while we wrap up here.
Sure. Yeah, so Real Food for Fertility is the newest book in the lineup. So like I said, I co-authored this with my friend Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. So she pulls in tons of stuff on um, hormone balance, the menstrual cycle, timing sex for conception, egg quality, sperm quality, and issues with hormonal birth control and how that can deplete certain nutrients, how long you need to come off of those in advance of conception for optimizing your nutrient stores. And then I take the reins on the nutrition content. So what is the optimal like macro and micronutrient intake to support fertility? What about intermittent fasting as we got into? What foods are most nutrient dense that optimally support your hormone balance, egg quality, improve your chances of conception? Again, all of these things like based directly on what's found in the literature. And then I also cover the chapters on vegetarian eating, some foods that can be not so great for overall fertility, supplementation, toxins, gosh, what else? There's a lot in there. Other health conditions that can affect fertility. So we go into like thyroid issues, fibroids, endometriosis, recurrent miscarriage. What about like MTHFR variations? Like some of those may affect fertility, some of them don't. Like a whole chapter on polycystic ovarian syndrome, another one on hypothalamic amenorrhea. We have meal plans, recipes. We included like adjustments to the meal plans, optionally if you're struggling with PCOS or hypothalamic amenorrhea, because that same nutrition approach doesn't work for all fertility challenges. So you want to probably be focusing on slightly different things, even if some core principles apply. So yeah, I think I covered just about everything that's in there. There's a lot in this book. It's really packed to the gills. It's like, I don't know, 1.5 inches thick. It's like I compare it to Real Food for Pregnancy, and I'm like, oh my God, is anyone really going to buy this? It's so big. And it's kind of nuts because we were really cutthroat with the editing on trying to get rid of anything that was extraneous, especially with the length of the book being so long. But at the end of the day, I mean, fertility is a reflection of your overall health. So we kind of have to go into things like digestive health and thyroid and like exercise and sleep, some of these foundational aspects, because they do ultimately affect fertility. So it really, in a way, is kind of like a whole body health book. And of course, since we have a chapter on sperm quality, which many books on fertility tend to leave out the male factor part of the equation, we do really hope that, like, we know most people buying are going to be women, but we hope that you also share it with your partner. I've already heard back from some readers that they did like read out loud some of the parts that applied to their partner who was kind of resistant to making any changes. And they actually finally were like, okay, I get it. All right, I'll do the thing. I'll stop having the alcohol. I'll cut back on the fried foods or whatever it is. And that's really reassuring because I don't know, I was a little worried the sperm chapter would be like I was like, no man's gonna read this. This is like too long. It's like it's one chapter out of the whole book. Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say out of the whole thing, like I think it's important because, or I think it'll be really helpful, honestly, like from my perspective, working in this world, men love the research. Like for me, I find with our clients, it's like, if I can show them the papers, it's not just their partner saying like, Kelsey told me that you have to stop doing this. It's like, okay, this is why I think we should consider this as an option. Like ultimately it's your decision, but here's where the recommendation is coming from. And so I love that there's the references included in this that when their wives or partners are reading it out loud to them, which is awesome. It's not them nagging. It's coming from
Right,
you ultimately, and
right.
they've got the data to back it up. So I think it's going to make a big difference
Yeah,
for a
we
lot of
take
women.
on being like the annoying person, being like, you need to do this, and
Yeah.
it's on us. It's not on you. You're just like,
Yeah.
hey, I read this thing that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I
And
do
here's the
also,
scientific paper to go along
yeah,
with
right.
it. Yeah.
I do also think it will hopefully help more partners get their sperm quality tested, because
Yeah.
that's a big hurdle, and you want to get your full results to compare them to like the various recommendations, which we have tables of it in the book, because you're only going to be flagged for like male factor infertility if your sperm quality is like absolutely in the basement.
Yeah.
And there is this sort of gray area of like subfertile, where like if your sperm quality isn't so bad that you qualify as infertile, but isn't quite optimal, there can be delays in conception. And actually, it can affect the trajectory of a pregnancy, like if you do conceive, because the sperm quality can affect the development of the placenta, and then the health of your placenta can affect the health of the pregnancy and your risk for complications, right? We need to be like rewinding the clock and looking at,
Right.
both partners. But having that information might be helpful if you can advocate for some sperm quality testing, like a semen analysis, and then compare the results, not just you're fine, but like compare the results and see where you're at. That sometimes is the motivation needed to make some of these changes. And we're pretty explicit on like where the data is on specific nutrients and so forth that can improve that. So I do hope that ends up moving the needle for some couples, because women have been bearing the brunt of the fertility conversation for decades, and it's not fair.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it'll be really helpful. Thank you so, so much for coming on. How I wrap up every episode is asking you what's one piece of fertility advice that you'd love to leave for someone who's listening right now?
Okay. I'm gonna go back to something we talked about earlier, because I want to really like nail this point home. Prioritize a protein-rich breakfast. And I
Mhm.
would say ideally for most people, that's going to be within 30 to 60 minutes of waking up. You might be a unicorn who does okay with morning intermittent fasting, but most women don't. So a protein-rich breakfast really sets the stage for a better day. Cravings, energy, blood sugar balance, cortisol, resiliency to stress. So even if you think I sound a little bit crazy with it, just give yourself like 3 days to try out a protein-rich breakfast. I do try to aim people towards 30 grams of protein. You might not get quite there while you're starting out, but like really make an effort. Give it 3 days and report back. Usually the results speak for themselves, but please give it a try.
Yeah, I find when women are like, but I'm not hungry. I'm like, well, you're not hungry because you haven't been feeding yourself. So if
Yes,
we
this is
just
true.
show the body like it's safe, I'm safe, I'm okay to be hungry because I am going to feed you at this time of day instead of waiting till lunch. Over time, you'll find your breakfast actually growing because you are hungrier and being able to eat more. But you almost have to start with like baby steps in the
Yeah, you might have
beginning.
to start with literally like a protein-rich snack for breakfast,
Mm-hmm.
and slowly move up from there. Like protein-rich snack, kind of kickstart your appetite and metabolism. A couple hours later, like bigger breakfast, and
Mm-hmm.
work your way up to the point that you can actually eat a meal at the beginning of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great advice because I feel like when you said breakfast tends to be the worst, I was like, oh, absolutely. I see that in practice for sure. Like women are like, oh, I eat really well, but then they're like either not eating breakfast or they're having like a piece of toast and that's it. So
Exactly.
I think that's a big area we can all make some adjustments to. So thank you so much, Lily, for coming on. The book is fantastic and I can't wait for everyone to get their hands on it. How can listeners find you?
So you can find me at Lily Nichols RDN. That's my main website, lilynicholsrdn.com, I should say. That's where my blog lives. I link out to my books there. a whole bunch of freebies are on my website. Social media is also a good place to find me. I'm most active on Instagram, and my handle's the same as my website. So Lily Nichols RDN, and look up Real Food for Fertility on Amazon. It's available currently in paperback and ebook. We will be recording an audiobook, hopefully at the end of this year. Lisa and I insist on narrating it ourselves, so we just have to plan out a time to actually record it and get it produced. So stay tuned.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Hopefully we can have you back, and good luck with the book promo.
Thank you.